Did you miss me? Hi, I'm the Warrior Witch, and you can call me Nike. Yes, I've been gone a few weeks, maybe a month, something like that. But, I wasn't doing great, so I figured practice what you preach, take care of your mental health. Took a little break. Not entirely. I've been, on Twitch and on Twitter, but those are my more low energy platforms where I don't have to put as much in as I do to YouTube. So I'm back. We've got some fun stuff, and I wanted to start off with something that I kind of realized that I skipped over in the past, which is sort of a how to, or rather how I research when I'm looking into a new topic. I was discussing this with some friends a while ago, and I realized that not everybody got the education on being able to do proper research that I did. I guess I was very lucky in that regard, and it's not as common as I thought it was. So I wanted to give some tips and tricks for how I look into new topics, how I take my notes, how I sort of parse through what is real, what's new, what's different, what's old, etc. So let's get into it. I've got my handy notes on my phone, so if I'm looking down, that's why. That's the reason. So obviously, you gotta start with a topic. That's sort of number one. And for a lot of people, it's overwhelming, so just start anywhere. Literally, you could put a bunch of topics in a hat, stick your hand in and pick one out. You gotta start somewhere. I usually, if you're really, really, really new, I would say start with the basics. Start with what is magic? How does magic work? Cleansing, protection, banishing, etc. But if you're going beyond that, picking a different topic like herbalism or astrology or tarot, picking a topic that you can get more niche with and start from there. And my main point with all of this is always going to be cross-reference. That's sort of going to be the undercurrent, the undertone to all of this, is that you'll always want to be cross-referencing what you find. So cross-referencing, very important, because, this source may say this thing, and this source may say this thing, and you might be a little bit lost. So just make sure that you're taking good notes and that you understand that there's going to be differences depending on where you go for sourcing. To keep track of all the information I learn, I try to take a lot of notes, as I mentioned. Now you can do this on paper, which I have in the past, I still do here and there, but more specifically, I recommend going digital. Now I have a video on, got it right, digital witchcraft, and that includes taking notes, making a book of shadows all digitally, and I find that a digital notebook, so to speak, really helps because you can Control F and just automatically find a word. So if you know that you took notes on, say you're doing tarot, you took notes on the magician card from somewhere, but it's somewhere buried in this new document that you've made. Well, if it's on paper, it's a little bit harder to find. You have to tear through every page, try to find it on the page. If you have a digital document, you can just Control F, magician, there you go, you found it right away. And it's easier to be able to move things around if you want to sort the information later. So I really like digital. I think it makes the whole research process a lot easier. Now, when starting an actual research topic, not everybody's going to agree. Personally, I think start with Google, and more specifically, start with Wikipedia. To be honest, a lot of the Wikipedia pages on magic-related stuff are not that bad. They have some good base information, and you'll hear the argument, well, anybody can edit Wikipedia, which is true, and you do have to be aware of that. But the great thing about Wikipedia is that Wikipedia gives you sources. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom of an article, you'll find right at the bottom a bunch of sources. They'll show who they're citing, where they're citing it from. They'll often have links that'll go to other places, so you can easily find those sources and go from there. So rather than just trusting Wikipedia at a base, Wikipedia can be your starting guide. If you can, I try to use this to find source material. So if something is talking about astrology, you might be able to find, Vedius Valens and some of these really, really old documents. The oldest that you can find, the more origin sources that you can find, the better. Same thing with mythology, trying to find original or as original as you can documents. When it comes to Greek and Hellenic practices, you have the PGM. With Norse sources, you have Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, those kinds of things. So the more core source material that you can find, the better, and Wikipedia is usually pretty good about being able to list those types of things. Things like plants are a little bit more iffy because you'll need to be looking at folklore, and folklore may vary by region. In fact, I would almost say it's guaranteed it's going to vary by region. So you may have to get a little bit more specific and search, if you're looking for German folklore because you have more Germanic practice, you could look up Germanic folklore X plant, or you could look up American folklore for X plant, or you could look up Asian folklore for X plant. It really depends on where the plant is originally from, what cultures use them a lot. If you're looking at folklore for, let's say, olives, olive trees, olive branches, olive oil, and you have more of a Hellenic practice, that would be a good place to look at how they use their things and how the folklore of that plant was sort of interwoven into their myths. Now, there's going to be some cases where you can't really find original source or original lore, and the biggest cases that I can point out is like Norse mythology. So I mentioned Snorri Sturluson. Well, Snorri Sturluson was not exactly from the Viking Age. He was a Christian source, so he wasn't a Norse pagan in the first place, and he was a few hundred years after sort of the core of the Viking Age, or what we consider to be the Viking Age. So with a lot of these sources, if they are not core source material, and even if they are, you have to consider some of the biases that are going to be interwoven into that. So with Snorri Sturluson as the example, he's a Christian author. You have to be able to remember that the way that he's going to portray some of these things, the way that he's going to talk about some of these things are going to be through that Christian lens rather than a Norse pagan lens. It's nicer to be able to get to true source when possible, and unfortunately it's not always possible because you have more of the origin of it with astrology and with Greek stuff. We have a lot more Greek documents because they just wrote a lot of stuff down. We have a lot more of it. So it's easier to see the way that it was sort of originally seen, originally viewed, originally studied. But you also have to keep in mind, even with origin sources, their culture is going to define certain things. I talked about in some podcasts and things where originally in Greece, slavery was a thing, and the sixth house in part represented slavery or enslavement. Now, that's not a thing currently, but when you're studying those, you have to understand that that was just a normal part of their culture. So while it may horrify you to think, how could that be part of astrology, you still have to remember that the biases of the sources are going to include things like that, things that were common at the time. Women having a different role than we consider them to have now, gender being more of a binary thing. The biases that are going to be present in any source always have to be taken into account. So make sure that you take those notes as well. If you need to do some cultural historical work as well, art history can be a great way for this. It gets a little bit deep, but if you can, the more that you can get in for context, the better. You also have to look at how some of these things have changed over time. So you may find, for example, with astrology in your research, you have various valens, but then you also have not the Greek stuff, but later on into the medieval period and then modern. And so sometimes when you're doing your research, you'll end up seeing how certain cultural customs, how certain folklore, how different practices have evolved over time. So things that were done 2,000 years ago may be wildly different from what is done currently, but you can see those threads and you can see that evolvement over time. So that would be a good thing to put in your notes as well. For things that have that longer recorded history, being able to see how things changed over different eras is very helpful, and you can sort of see what things are still done now, where they came from and where they were influenced. Now, in terms of actual sources and source materials that you can go to, not necessarily like original source, but things to source your information from, this is where I start getting into books. Now, books can get kind of hard, and they can also get pricey, so we'll address that too. But when it comes to books, you do have to remember that anybody can write a book. Anybody can self-publish at this point. It's not exactly writing a book does not make you automatically an expert, since anybody can write them. So you do have to keep in mind that just because it's written and published and out in, say, Barnes & Noble, doesn't mean that it's necessarily trustworthy, which is, if we go all the way back to the beginning, why we cross-reference and why we try to find different sources. That said, books are still a wonderful, valuable source. I have a little bookshelf right next to me. I have loads of books that I like to reference myself, and I think that it's a good place to start. Now, for affording books, certain things can be found free and legally online. The older texts usually are more of that case, but you can also get cheap or trial services like Scribd. Scribd is about, I think, $10 a month, but you can also get a free trial if it's your first time doing it. I'm not sponsored, I just really like it. And you can get digital, like reading documents. You can get audio versions if you are more of an auditory learner, which can be great because it certainly helps me with my ADHD. But it can be an easier way to afford books and resources that maybe you wouldn't have the money for. You wouldn't be able to afford 1,300 books because it's going to cost you thousands of dollars. Well, you can probably afford $10 a month, or if you can't, free trial, baby. I'm just saying. Anyway, I like to reference from books, and when it comes to referencing from books, just gonna put my phone away, don't mind me. Oh, where's my, oh, they're probably in the other room, huh? And when it comes to sourcing from books, bibliographies are your best friend, and let me tell you why. Bibliographies not only give you insight into where the author is coming from, but also it may give you leads to sources that maybe you were struggling to find before. So let's go with Matt Oren's Psychic Witch. It's a good book, you should get it if you can. Excellent, A++. Matt is a great author and a great source of knowledge if you're curious about stuff. He has social media, he's cool. Anyway, he has in the back of his book a bibliography, and in this bibliography, just to pick out a couple of things, he has Michelle Belanger's Psychic Energy Codex, Laurie Cabot, a couple of things from Laurie Cabot, some things from Aleister Crowley, Lon Milo Duquette, Storm Fairy Wolf, Gerald Gardner, Raven Grimassi, Eliphas Levi? I'm going with Levy. Eliphas Levy. Jason Miller, who I also have books from. I think Jason Miller is also an excellent author to read from. Christopher Penczak, who is very popular. Aidan Watcher, who I also have his 6 Ways, and he references directly from Aidan Watcher's 6 Ways. Laura Tempest Zakroff, among others. So you can look and see exactly what Matt's influences are, what things he referenced for his book, and if you read into those other books, you can see some of the inspirations and the references that he makes. But if you were to say, look at that bibliography and pick out, let's say, Aidan Watcher's 6 Ways, which I also have, you can open up Aidan Watcher's 6 Ways and find he doesn't have a bibliography per se, and you'll find this sometimes too, that it's not a bibliography but a recommended reading or a suggested reading as it's listed here, but you can look at other books that he recommends, and he actually goes in depth. So he talks about wanting to have a standalone text, but there are other things that you can focus on. So he lists, for example, Jason Miller, again, so clearly very popular between these two. He even lists Marie Kondo, and if you know anything about Marie Kondo, you know interesting, and it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. And people like Peter J. Carroll and Kenneth Grant, which we also saw in Matt's. So you can see a lot of these similar threads, and as you go through, you can build your sort of library of stuff that you want to look into, you want to reference, you want to look up what maybe they've put online, because a lot of people may have social media. I know that Matt Oren for sure does, Aidan Watcher does, and you may be able to find some of the more free content if you can't afford their books just yet. Like Matt Oren has a Pathos blog, so you may be able to read some of his insights there, some of his advice, and you never know what you'll find on some of those. So you can start with people that they recommend, you can find what other people have to say about them, which of their books people recommend specifically, and just sort of expand out. The bibliographies and recommended readings are not always in the back. That's the case with my Prose Edda book. It's the Penguin Classics version. If you want a book version of the Prose Edda, I do actually recommend this one. It's very good. But with this one, the recommended reading and other reference works are actually in the middle of the book, fairly early on. They're before like the page 1, page 2, etc. They're in the like XXI early stuff. But there's primary text, there's Icelandic text, there's reference works, there's studies, and so this can lead you into more of the academic setting, which we'll get to next. References more of Snorri Sturluson's work, because this is not directly by Snorri Sturluson, this is translations and things. You can also get different texts. John Lindau's Norse mythology. So there's studies and more academic works. There's primary text with things like the Poetic Edda, the Saga of Hrolf Kraki, the Saga of the Volsungs, the Saga of the Inglings, the Heimskringla. So you can see a lot of the like actual source text that he lists, and you can find as far back as we possibly have to be able to get as close to source as possible. So being able to look at the bibliographies, the suggested works, the references, those are going to be a really great way to find more of what other people are referencing. Let's talk about academics and scholarly works next. So scholarly stuff can be a little bit harder to read, a little bit more of an advanced reading level. Even for those who are fairly skilled readers, they can be a little bit tough. So not everybody quite wants to go here, but if you can, and you can look up scholarly articles about blank, it would be a good idea to try to. I try to find specifically professional. So if you're looking for astrology stuff, try to find stuff from professional astrologers because they'll have a wealth of knowledge from actual practical experience as well as studies that they have done. Social media is a great way for this. I know that the book that I have that I adore, Chris Brennan's Hellenistic Astrology book, he has a lot of social media. He has his podcast. So if you just looked into him as a practicing professional astrologer, he has a lot of great insights to give you. Same thing with Demetra George, whose books I also have. You know, professionals are a great way to learn because they can talk about specific cases that they've seen. So Chris can talk about charts that he's read and examples he's seen and saved over time to be able to reference, which he does in his podcast a lot. Same thing goes with like folklorists and herbalists, people that have this history behind them, people that have done studies. I know that Thorn Mooney in particular, who I adore, love her. If you're not following her on every platform, you should be. Thorn Mooney also has, oh boy, I think it's a master's. I could be wrong. I'm gonna say master's. I'm sorry if I'm wrong, Thorn. She has a master's in theology, so she has a lot of religious studies behind her and she can give a lot of context behind certain things, and so she has a more professional educational background behind that to be able to support some of the studies that she does, so she may be able to point you to other references. The scholarly world is difficult, but the nice thing is that if you know where to look, it can be easier to find more academically minded things. They're not going to be magical necessarily, because most people who are in the academic world are not necessarily focusing on the magic part. They're focusing on the historical, the cultural, the religious context behind them. So if you're looking for magic, you want more of the witchcraft books, Llewellyn, Weiser, those kind of publishers. But if you want the more academic stuff, that's going to be more in the like mundane area, the scholarly area. If you were a college or high school student, you could actually ask your professors or librarians to help you find some of these scholarly things. They can be really, really useful in giving more context to some of the magical traditions that you may be looking into. So if you're looking at how to use an herb magically, well, you could try to find stuff from folklorists and historians and cultural anthropologists, people that can find the cultural meaning behind some of these things, which can then inform the magical meanings and the magical uses. The nice thing about scholastic, scholarly, academic works is that they're going to have really good sources. And that's not to say that magical books like Aidan Watcher's 6 Ways or Matt's Psychic Witch are not good sources, because they are. I recommend them very highly. I wouldn't if I didn't think they were great. But when it comes to like academically minded research things, that's the way to go. My camera's gonna die. How far can we get? Probably not far. So yeah, the undercurrent I want to stress is just looking at other sources, looking for academic things if you have the availability to, looking at ways to take your notes that makes them easy to find things in, like digital versions so you can Control F, and that can all make your process a lot easier. And the more notes you take, the better. That's all I've got for you guys this week. If you want to follow me, you can find me at Warrior Witch Nike pretty much everywhere. I have a website, I have a Patreon, I have a podcast that I do called Magnolias Magic. We just rebranded recently, so don't be confused. That's our podcast. Otherwise, that's all I got. So see you next time, and blessed be. Did it before the camera shut off. Oh yeah, I'm cool.